As the Dallas Cowboys head onto the Oxnard field for their last week of practice, which young Cowboys had career-saving performances on Saturday against Vegas? And how will the acquisitions at the defensive line and cornerback that have been made in the last month shake out the competition for those spots behind the starters? All that and more on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. I am your host, Landon McCool. I'd like to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen of every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can get $5, can bet $5 and get 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. Coming up on today's show, I wanted to take a deeper look at the acquisitions made in the defensive backfield and the defensive line, just to see how these new faces are affecting the competition at those spots just behind the starters, right? The Carl Lawsons, the Jordan Phillips, the Keemon Halls. How do they fit into the pecking order that is already assembled right beneath the starters, and are they likely to make this squad? But first, I wanted to talk about a couple of different guys that I thought had what I'm calling career-saving performances on Saturday. And maybe there's some hyperbole here, but I also don't think that that's necessarily too outrageous to think. The NFL is very difficult, and you don't get a ton of chances or opportunities a lot of times, especially if you're kind of a down roster guy. So if for some of these folks, it is a make or break situation. And I kind of wanted to cover a couple guys that I felt like really kind of pulled themselves back from the void. So as I mentioned, the preseason games are important to these young players, but I would argue that these three folks that I'm about to mention, their positive performances on the field on Saturday really have maybe changed their opportunities, changed their outlooks, and it kind of just proves the point of exactly how frail an NFL opportunity is, and how quickly on a dime your opportunity can kind of change. And we have to start with Deuce Vaughn. And honestly, it's a good portion of why I wanted to do this segment. We didn't get a chance to talk much about Deuce Vaughn's performance on Saturday. And he hasn't had much in the way of positive momentum since being drafted by the Cowboys. His rushing stat line for 2023 was 23 carries for 40 yards, which is just over 1.7 yards per attempt, which for those who are laymen is not good, is very, very bad. He fared a little bit better as a receiver, specifically in the screen game, but the tape matched those stats. Like when you watched what he was doing last year, it didn't look good. He looked overmatched. He looked like he was trying to get around guys in a way that he still felt like he had that kind of athleticism advantage that he had in college, but that had evaporated. And so for me and for others, the thought was, well, if this guy is undersized, he's not quite as quick as he was comparatively to the college players he was playing against just a few years ago. Is there enough talent here to let him really kind of shine through? And it just all seemed to be trending in the wrong direction, as this season kind of played out too. You saw that he had a hamstring injury. He missed a lot of practice. He missed the first preseason game. It was all starting to kind of, look poorly on him. And again, all of that under the guise of this is a guy who is an undersized player who is not particularly explosive from a testing point of view. So Deuce being famously undersized, and the NFL also seemed to be missing this special something that he was supposed to help him overcome his quickness. And without that kind of explosive power that Darren Sproles had, how would he be able to break tackles and kind of make a living in a running back? And so then on Saturday night, he comes out and he looks like a different back. He looks more natural. The game appears to have slowed down from him. He seems to be more decisive. I was listening to Brian Broaddus, shout out to Brian Broaddus on this, who pointed out that he's not dancing as much behind the line of scrimmage. And I think that was a big point, is that he is just making he's making a decision. He's getting upfield. He's breaking into the hole. He's not trying to dance around folks or think that he's, exceptionally quicker than all these guys in the NFL, because that's not the case. But he's still valuable when he makes smart decisions, when he uses his vision. He gets north and south, he gets low, he's difficult to kind of get down and make a tackle. So I think, this is a situation where if he can kind of continue to show this with, and let's be clear, I think part of this too is that he's gotten better blocking. And I think once he gets better blocking, he gets a little bit of a runway past the line of scrimmage. That's when you're going to see Deuce Vaughn kind of make plays. And that's really where the concern has been at the times, is what is he going to do when he gets caught behind the line of scrimmage? So I think if he can continue to be kind of more decisive and make these breaks with his vision and not try to out quick or juke every single linebacker that he comes in, within 5 yards with, I do think that, you can eke out a better career, and he can be a little bit of a juice back for this team if he can kind of continue to play with that sort of demeanor, realizing that, hey, I'm not quick enough to dance around these guys. I need to get north. I need to find the spot to get past the guy instead of just trying to dance in front of him. So I do think that was a positive, very positive showing. I think you ended up with 30 plus yards on 5 carries, or almost 7 yards a pop. So that's a very good sign for a guy that, we were honestly concerned about when we were ever going to see that kind of performance from a guy that obviously had a very, very storied career in college. The second guy is even lucky to have been given an opportunity to play in this game, and that's Albert Huggins. Huggins was signed on August 6th, and after being with the team for just over a week, he was taking part in a joint practice with the Rams, and there was a pass rush drill, and as he was finishing up his pass rush drill, Huggins shoved a Rams assistant to the ground. This led to a skirmish, and then Huggins eventually being ejected from the practice field by the Cowboys. Many people were calling for Huggins to be cut by the team, which I think is not unreasonable. I mean, he was basically assaulted a coach. Oh, not a coach, but assistant. I mean, even more so, right? Like a volunteer assistant. So I think you have to protect your support personnel. And frankly, I was a little bit shocked that he wasn't cut. And I'm not shocked that he was pulled off the field. That seemed very appropriate. He did apologize to the team, but it did seem like, no one liked this guy afterwards, and for good reason, because of that kind of attitude and that kind of behavior. But then he goes out on the practice on the game field against the Raiders, and he plays a very good game. Now, again, does that overshine what he did on the field? Absolutely not. But I think that if he had been cut after that incident, or if he had been kicked off the field and then gone in and put out a terrible game against the Raiders, I think there's a good chance that he would have gotten cut and probably not played again, because NFL teams aren't about, trying to get involved with guys that, are going to be problems for their coaching staff. Like, I think that there's a lot of tolerance for a lot of terrible stuff in the NFL, but probably not assault on the other coaches. The fact that he, apologized, the fact that he came out and played a better game means that likely that he's going to either continue to be on this team, or will get a better opportunity on with some other team at some point. And finally, Trey Lance. And okay, I'm half joking, but considering the cost invested in the time, the Cowboys needed to see some improvement from Trey Lance, right? Either in the second or third preseason game. And the fact that it was the second preseason game, I think portends well that he is improving at a great rate. We saw a lot of people, have some comments about Trey Lance's performance, including, some great quarterback gurus and everything. I think universally we can agree that Trey Lance put in a much better performance on Saturday against the Raiders. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he improved. He did get better at some of the things. Consistency is going to be an issue until it's not. And I think that's where he's continuing to work. But I think the Cowboys did him a lot of favors by giving him an opportunity to kind of run a game plan that would be taking advantage of a lot of his skill set. And again, I think you cannot be underimpressed with the way he handled that touchdown scoring drive and the drive to set up the field goal. He understood how much time he had on the clock. He was able to get up and down to allow for enough time to set up the long field goal. That's the kind of thing that I talk about when I mention that he has a lot of the kind of things you can't teach. He understands how to manage the game. He understands how to do the things like that are important. So I do think that Trey Lance has shown improvement. Like I said, I have a feeling even if he had gotten cut, somebody probably would take a flyer on him. So this one was maybe not so much a career saver, but I do think that in very similar ways to the other two guys that I mentioned, that he definitely has a career turnaround. And I think that that's super impressive and super important for a guy that has not played a lot of football and has not had a lot of opportunity. So let's talk about some guys who have had more opportunity in these last few games with these defensive backs who have come onto the roster. And what does that mean for the guys that were already here when they arrived? We'll talk about that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5, just $5, and get 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. They just announced all the additions, all the fixes that they've made to YouTube TV is super exciting. This is an incredible deal. Once you have your YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. All you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Guys, the Cowboys are currently plus 1,800 to win the Super Bowl. And I know. It's the last 30 years, the Cowboys are terrible. They can't win the playoffs. But it's $5. Put in $5. Come on, let's just throw in $5. And you get 3 free weeks of YouTube TV Sunday Ticket, which is an incredible deal. So you guys just make sure you check it out. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook, FanDuel. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Thank you for making the Locked On Cowboys podcast your first listen today. For your second listen, make sure you go listen to enjoy the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we talked about the fact that the Cowboys have been adding some folks in the defensive backfield and the defensive line group. Obviously, the defensive line group got a little bit more harumph to it because signing a guy like Carl Lawson will do that. Making a trade for Jordan Phillips will get you excited. But the Cowboys quietly also added some folks in the cornerback room, as I mentioned, and I think that they've done some stuff that's actually worth mentioning and certainly worth kind of discussing in the context of their effect on the other folks that are in the defensive backfield roster. Below the Blands and the Diggs and the Lewises of this team. So let's start with K'Mon Hall. Hall was a guy that I had mentioned, after the first preseason game. I thought, played some good snaps, had done some good things. He was a guy that the Cowboys had claimed off waivers on July 28th from San Francisco. He's 27 years old. He's kind of bounced around a lot for these last few years, but they had an interview with him on DallasCowboys.com. He seems like a very mature guy. I mean, he's 27, so that's going to help, but I think he sounds like a very serious guy who understands that his opportunities are kind of running out. And I think he's really making the most of it. Like I said, we mentioned his play after the first preseason game and how we thought it was, he was a physical guy. He is mostly playing in the nickel situation, which that's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring him up, is because there still is very much an open competition happening for the backup nickelback, the guy that will come off the field when Jordan Lewis gets hurt, or if he needs a breather. We've talked about the fact Diggs and Bland. I mean, Bland has history playing in the slot, so if he needed to, you could reduce him down there if you had to. Obviously, it's not ideal. Kalen Carson, who is the fourth corner on this team, very securely the fourth corner on this team, he's not so much a nickel guy as much as we kind of thought he would be coming out of college. So it really is kind of an open competition. K'Mon Hall is stepped up as much as anybody to try to make that his job. And in this last game, he really stepped up. He had 2 pass deflections and a pick 6 versus Vegas. By the way, that was his first pick 6 since he had one in college against John Stephen Jones, who was Stephen Jones's son at Arkansas when he was playing, obviously Jerry's grandson, which I thought was an incredible coincidence. What are the odds of that? So Kamon's a guy that I think is going to make it difficult to cut him. He's played very well out here. You've seen him making plays in the ball. He's been physical, which is a key thing that we've talked about. The nickel spot, you have to be a physical tackle. He did miss a tackle on Saturday, but I thought overall, from what we've seen him in the training camp field and in the majority of what I've seen of him in the games, he's been a pretty solid tackler. So I thought that he's really done some impressive stuff. And he's, kind of put himself in the mix for that spot behind Jordan Lewis. The other guy the Cowboys added, Andrew Booth. Obviously, we've discussed this. He was a former second-round pick. I think he was the 42nd overall pick for the Vikings, so a high second-round pick. He's only 23 years old. This is the guy that we acquired from Minnesota in that trade for Nahshon Wright. He also had a very good game on Saturday. Obviously, he didn't play the week before, the preseason week one, because the Cowboys didn't have, or he played, but he didn't play for the Cowboys. He had a pretty good game though against Vegas. I mean, he gave up a big play early in the game, but I thought after that he really settled down and played solid football. He ended up getting credited with 8 tackles, and you saw that. Like, he was basically all over the field. He was coming down. He was making tackles in the flat when there was outlet passes out there. Just a very reliable, physical outside guy. It feels like he's a little bit more consequential, I guess is the word, than Nahshon Wright. I mean, it just seems like he's around the ball more, which can be a good and a bad thing. Obviously, he gave up that big play, but Nahshon Wright obviously was not unknown for giving up big plays randomly. So I think it's just another guy that he's more of an outside guy, but I think that the Cowboys, really wanted to get another outside guy to kind of pair with, to have a full set behind Diggs and Bland with the pair with Carson. So Andrew Booth is the guy that, his special teams, he's going to be a big thing for all these guys, especially for Booth. But I think that Booth, of a lot of these guys that are kind of pedigree guys, Booth obviously being a second-round pick, being only 23 years old, and playing outside, I think kind of gives him maybe a little bit more of an advantage over Kamon Hall if we were try to measure the likelihood of these two players playing. There's a lot more there with Andrew Booth as far as pedigree and potential future upside and that sort of thing. A couple guys we have to talk about that are not new acquisitions but are in this same battle for spots. Izzy Mukuamu and Eric Scott, I think, are the two kind of main folks here. Izzy is interesting. We've been pointing out that he's been a nickel for a while now. He's mostly only been playing nickel from what I've seen these last few weeks. So I think that, Mike McCarthy called him in practice, in the interview yesterday, an exceptional matchup piece. And that sounds like somebody to me that's likely to make the team. And he's also talked about how he's, he can play nickel, he can play safety. He's getting improved a lot in special teams. I think that really likely that it's going to come down to, between Izzy, Eric Scott, Andrew Booth, and Kamon Hall, maybe 2 of those 4 guys make it. And I think Izzy is, to me, out of all these guys, the most likely to make it, simply because of all the, what we talked about, the versatility, the matchup stuff he can do. He can play nickel, he can play safety. I think for Eric Scott, I mean, first of all, Eric Scott is 2 years older than Izzy Mukuamu, despite having been in the league 2 less years, and he just hasn't done enough. We just haven't seen it enough from him. And I wanted to see him kind of come out here and take advantage of this opportunity, but I just have not seen it, especially in comparison to everything else that we've seen from these other guys. So I think that Eric Scott, to me, of these guys, seems like the least likely to make it. I wouldn't be shocked if the Cowboys made a trade for Eric up to Washington, just because, maybe he needs to go back to his old coach and kind of be given an opportunity there. Either way, I do think that you're going to see an incredibly intense competition for these last few cornerback roster spots. And ultimately it may come down to who the best special teams player is. So there's a lot of things to kind of calculate there when trying to figure out exactly how that's all going to sort out. And it's a little bit difficult to kind of parse it. And there's still one more game to kind of let them kind of play themselves out. And maybe this will kind of help settle itself in this next contest at this coming up weekend. All right, let's talk about the similar situation except with the defensive line and the acquisitions that the Cowboys have made there in the last week. We'll talk about that when we come right back. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Every day or on tomorrow's podcast, I will be answering your questions. Marcus is still not here, obviously, so make sure you send your questions to me on Twitter at McCoolBCB. You can also send them to the Locked On Cowboys podcast account, or if you're watching us on YouTube right now, you can just leave a comment right down below, and I'll try to grab it off of there, and maybe I'll read your question on the show. All right, let's talk about the defensive line and the acquisitions that have happened rapidly over the last week. In just the last 7 days, the Cowboys have dramatically reshaped two of their key backup spots along the defensive line. Some of it is in reaction to the injury to Sam Williams. Some of it is due to disappointing play and guys like Simi Fehoko we'll talk about in a second. But clearly the Cowboys have been, trying to keep their powder dry a little bit in that situation. They saw a couple different situations that they wanted to move on, and then they did so kind of in quick succession. So let's talk about the first one, Jordan Phillips, who was obtained via trade by the Cowboys to they sent a 2026 sixth rounder for Phillips and a 2026 seventh rounder. I've also heard that that's a conditional pick based on the number of games that he is active for. It might be games that he has started for. I might need to check that, but there is a condition added to this situation that would void the actual trade if for some reason he doesn't make it onto the roster for a certain amount of games. So he is an enormous guy. If you haven't seen him yet, he's 6'3", 345 pounds plus. And when you signed him, obviously a lot of Cowboys fans were like, okay, great. Now we've got another solution at nose tackle. This guy is he's 340 pounds. He's a slobber knocker. He's a big guy you can stick in the middle, won't get moved. He's a nose tackle. You go and watch the tape, though. You watch it from this preseason. You watch it from previous seasons. And then you talk to Jordan Phillips himself, and he speaks more like a three technique. He plays in the B gap a lot. Like when you watch his tape, he's mostly playing in the B gap. He's trying to get off the ball quickly and be a penetrator. So I think that there has been some discussion about the fact that he's, a big guy and he could be a nose tackle. But the truth of the matter is that I think this is more than likely a backup for Osa Odigizua more than it is potentially a backup for Mazi or a rotational guy for Mazi at the nose tackles. It's an interesting situation because he is so big and there's an anticipation there. But I mean, I think if you look at this roster and you look at the bodies they like what they have in Justin Rogers. Carl Davis, was on this team and just was recent released. I think that also contributed to the fact that people thought that Jordan Phillips was going to end up a nose tackle. I think they like Rogers a lot. I think that they may even like Daxon a little bit. I think where they have had some issues is trying to figure out a backup three technique, right? And let's talk about that a little bit. Really where they've been hurt is Fehoko basically failing out of defensive tackle and defensive end. And that's really what kind of, I think, accelerated a lot of this is that, they tried Fehoko at tackle and they're like, oh yeah, that's definitely not working. He's not an under tackle. Let's kick him out the defensive end. He doesn't really seem to be able to do that. He is kind of a tweener between those two spots, can't seem to find a home. And so, for someone like Jordan Phillips, they needed a guy that could be a three technique penetrator because without Fehoko being a viable option, you've got Golston, but Golston is truly this kind of matchup player. I mean, I just don't know that you can rely on putting Golston into the depth chart just naturally, right? Like I wouldn't want Golston to go out there and play a whole game at defensive end or defensive tackle. I think where he is best is lining up, on specific plays in specific spots in specific scenarios. And I think he is very valuable in that role, but I just don't know that you can account for him as I wouldn't count on him being, and I think this is what the Cowboys are saying too, I wouldn't count on him being the full-time backup three technique. That's probably too many snaps for him to be playing inside, and there's probably too many run plays where he'll be caught inside and potentially get into a double team, and it could be ugly. So I think that even though we like Golson, I think he does present kind of a roster quandary because you don't really necessarily want to put him as the full-time backup at either of these two positions, and enter Jordan Phillips and also enter Carl Lawson, right? Because as Sam Williams got injured, there's been lots of talk about, okay, Nealon obviously is going to need to step up, but Nealon likely already had maybe a more minor role, a role as part of this rotation. So you needed somebody else to kind of step in and take Nealon's role as Nealon takes Sam Williams' role. Again, Golson is a guy, absolutely, you can give him snaps out there, and he can give you some good snaps out there, but to rely on Golson to be a full-time defensive end, especially, some of the run stuff against tackles, I don't know that that's necessarily the best solution. So what do the Cowboys do? They went out and worked out a couple of defensive ends a few weeks ago, including two guys they signed in Shockey and Al-Quadin Muhammad, who is still on the roster. We'll talk about him in a second. And Carl Lawson, who they didn't sign at the time, but have come back since, I think officially yesterday, signed him to the team. And who's Carl Lawson? If you don't know, if you don't follow John Owning or myself or anybody that likes Carl Lawson, he is an elite hand technician, on par with the DeMarcus Lawrences of the world. And I think that he's an edge. He's likely to play on the right side to kind of supplement Parsons early downs, and against the run. He's a good player against the run. He's a fantastic pass rusher. The Cowboys signed him to a 1 year, I think $2 million max deal, which is great. So I think for the Cowboys, and putting in Carl Lawson in a role that kind of fits him perfectly, it's sort of kind of what they did with Fowler. You put him in a position where he can use his skill set really well, and you're going to potentially get a lot out of a guy that is a veteran who you may not want to put into a role where he's the starter or he's the sole breadwinner at that position. So I'm excited to see what Carl Lawson does in conjunction with the rest of these defensive ends as part of a rotation with Micah Parsons. And I think that's going to be a very beneficial relationship for Carl Lawson, for Micah Parsons, for D-Law, for Mozzie Smith. I think having another guy out there who has excellent hand technique use is going to be great for every single one of these younger players, because they're going to have an opportunity to sit at the feet of two masters instead of just one kung fu master teaching everybody the cross chop. Now you've got the two best cross choppers maybe in football teaching these guys. A couple of the guys I want to hit before we go. We talked about Al-Quadin Muhammad, who was a recent vet pickup. He's definitely down on the roster spots. I thought he's had some decent snaps, and I understand it's against the second and third team when he's a veteran, but I thought he's actually played pretty decent, giving you some good looks. And then Nealon, we touched on briefly, but he's been fantastic out here. He's not a problem. Certainly Carl Lawson signing isn't a commentary on Nealon's development. Nealon is ahead of schedule. I would say it's very ahead of schedule of where he's supposed to be. And there isn't any doubts or issues with the way he's practicing. I think if anything, this is in order to supplement Nealon and to give the guys underneath him even more opportunity to kind of be subbed in, give Nealon a breather, because I think that they're going to use Nealon in a lot more different ways and a lot more kind of reduced down inside NASCAR package stuff. So as they start to use him more, the need for that kind of another rotational quality vet defensive end, it becomes higher, and it moves to the forefront of what you're going to need on this roster going into 2025. And that's it for us today, guys. Thank you for making Locked On Cowboys podcast your first listen of the day. Now go listen to the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. You can find the link to the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And that's it for us. Make sure you guys check us out tomorrow. We'll have your questions. And until then, happy trails, everybody.